Good morning. Great to see you all. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the room. And to those of you who are new to the conference, thank you very much for being here. David gave you a little bit of my history. I started my career as a journalist, as he mentioned, and then was about 10 years an implementer, running a content management team at an SI. And I spent the last 10 years as a market analyst and starting this new role where it's sort of all coming full circle for me. And it's really always exciting and a highlight of my year to kick off this event. So this year, we're going into the engine room. Welcome.
Daniel à la cabine pour la marche 093-02, départ. Départ dans les avions reçus.
This is the Tate JP, très grande vitesse, very big speed. Who's taken this train? Anyone? Okay, quite a few of you, I'm sure. This was in 2007, the moment that the TGV broke the speed records. It's since been eclipsed by Japanese and Chinese trains, and of course all these different trains and engines try to eclipse one another. I remember the first time I took this train probably about 25 years ago. And I was so in awe of how fast it was going. I was so in awe of how smooth it was. I was so in awe of the fact that I looked out the window and there was actually a tiny little plane that couldn't keep up with the train. It was remarkable. It was awesome. Now, trains and the engines that power them have come a long way in the last 250 years. Steam locomotives were actually the first ones powered by engines. These sorts of engines revolutionized transport. This is George Stephenson and his son Robert, who were English engineers. They invented a steam locomotive called the rocket. At least that's what they came to call it and what it became known as. It's the most famous example of an evolving design. And it wasn't the first steam locomotive, but it was the most innovative. They brought together many different things that had already been done. A lot of times when we think about innovation, we think we have to have a new idea. But we often don't. Stephenson and his son, they applied new fuel, new types of fuel. They applied a better driving force to the pistons and to the engine. And they created the fastest steam locomotive, and it won a contest in 1829 as the fastest train between Liverpool and Manchester in the north of England. And their innovations were copied. It was the very first train that brought people all around the UK. The whole island began to start to be connected by railways and trains. People could get around. This engine became known for speed, reliability, and its innovation. It's very similar to what we might like out of our dam systems. Speed, reliability, innovative, connectivity to bring us together, to connect our assets using great technology. However, it wasn't quite so easy. With new technology always comes complications. It's never as easy as just buying a piece of technology. If there's anything I've learned over the last 22 years working in various technology fields, it's that dam systems are not the whole solution any more than the engine is the whole train. So there's a lot of great tools that you can buy out there, but it takes a lot more than the engine to make things work. So when Stephenson's invention became well known, and everybody wanted to use it to get around, there were some complications. The first complication was that the entire island was still on solar time. Okay? So you can imagine that was a bit of a problem. The time in Bristol, which is almost on the west coast of England, was actually 10 minutes behind London. So you can imagine when a train was leaving London and it was going to Bristol, it was very difficult to actually coordinate the time and the schedule and when the trains were actually going to show up. And this caused all kinds of problems. Schedules were a mess, there were accidents on the tracks, trains collided. Everyone was so excited about this new technology, all these innovations, all these investments that were made of time and science and energy, new types of fuel, but there was no standard. Right? There was no process in place to actually make this work properly. So what happened? Well, they came up with a standard to make it work. They came up with a process to make it work. Many of you are probably familiar with Greenwich Mean Time. Right? We constantly use GMT when we're measuring time. This is where time begins in the world. It is now where I live. And on the mornings that I'm adequately motivated, I jog up the hill in Greenwich Park to the observatory. And I think, this is where time starts. This is where we measure everything. This is the standard that was established so that the train system would actually work properly. So as it became clear that this was necessary for the train system to work, they not only established Greenwich Mean Time, but they realized that they actually had to have additional technology to make sure the standard was communicated across all of the island of England, right, and Scotland and Wales, so that the train system would be connected. This took a really long time. It took almost 3 years to standardize time. Time finally got synchronized in 1840. Okay, so let's think about the fact that this engine and this train, and then the infrastructure that they built, the tracks and everything, got laid down between 1829 and 1835, but it took them that long to actually standardize time. So it's kind of similar with how we often approach dam projects. We buy great technology, we look for things that are innovative, we get new fuels, we set up tools, and then we start running them right away. We put a whole bunch of assets in them. We don't think about, well, what's the standards? What's the metadata? What's really going to make this work so that our trains don't collide on the tracks? So yesterday in my tutorial, I made the statement that everybody should invest 3 to 5 times as much money in people, process, and master data management as they do in the tools that they buy. And I had a couple people sort of lean back and said, that's never going to work. It's never going to happen. I can't actually convince my management team to do that. Well, then you will fail. Your trains will collide. You will not get from point A to point B, and you will have a really bad derailment somewhere between your assets getting in the system and trying to get to that destination or that customer that they're trying to get to. So finally, after all these years in Greenwich, they established the standard time, and then they had to invest in other technology to actually make it work. They had to buy telegraphs because they had to communicate with all the different places, of course, around as to what time it actually was. And one of the things I've learned, you can imagine in Greenwich there's a lot of jokes about time among the locals. And that little ball on the top of the Greenwich Observatory, it goes up to the top every day at noon. And it comes back down, and that's how these sailors who left from the Greenwich port set their time. And that's where the expression on the ball comes from. There we go. It might be an apocryphal story, but I like it, so it's fun to tell. So finally, in 1850s, the United States standardized time. In India, it happened in 1860. But this was all driven by the fact that this new technology needed to be adopted, right? The governance, the proper exchange and communication of data, not just the technology, is what made the system work. we're not actually laying these tracks. We're still not. And because I spent the last 10 years of my career so focused on tools and technology, I'm really focused on the other side now. Because I watch people buy these tools and fail miserably and invest a lot of money in these tools and not doing these other things, right? Not actually coming up with the legislation, not actually coming up with the governance, not coming up with the metadata, and the managed services to tie it all together. We just build the engines. And what good is that? What was funny as well that I've learned being a Greenwich resident is that many people actually, when Greenwich Mean Time was established, actually they refused to adopt the standard. They stubbornly stayed in their silo, and they came up with their own clocks. So this is on the Bristol train station where there's 2-minute hands so that they could still keep track to this day of 10 minutes time difference from London. And sometimes we're just as stubborn in our own silos, aren't we? We're going to keep doing it our way. I wouldn't want to be on that train. So DAM is an engine with many moving parts, but it's only the engine. The system is only the engine, right? It gives you pretty basic functionality, right? It allows you to ingest assets. It has some basic workflow features. It allows you to search for things. It allows you to relate things and put them in collections and transform formats and distribute assets. It gives you some role and some group security. But it doesn't provide the fuel. It doesn't provide the governance, and it does not break down the silos all by itself. That takes people power. It takes you, as human beings, to really make it happen. So what happens when we don't do this? So I'll tell some cautionary tales, and then I'll talk about some happy stories. What happens when we don't break down the silos, when we don't exchange and coordinate data? I'll give a very serious example. So terrorists get their job done, unfortunately. How many times have we read after terrorist attacks? This man was known to authorities. He was in the database. We knew about him. We had records. We knew that he traveled from here to there on this day. This is an article on the BBC that I read shortly after the attack in Berlin last Christmas. And I always save these quotes where they talk about the lack of information exchange. And the EU commissioner said, the EU needs to do more and better when it comes to exchanging information. The attack in Berlin highlighted the fragmentation of the security services and the counterterrorism services. Each of Germany's 16 states has its own police and intelligence services, and on top of that is the federal agencies, and they all manage their data separately, differently, and they don't share it. So take this back to the DAM industry, right? We're in our information silos. There's a lack of sharing. There's territorialism. We need to move beyond that. We need to think bigger. Here's a map of how, after the attack, this person moved around through all these countries, and of course the information was not exchanged. They didn't pick him up until he had already been through so many different places. And yet they had the whole trail, the whole time, and they discovered it after the fact. So what we need to do is we need to take our metadata to a new dimension. It's not just a matter of making sure we have the right metadata, we have the assets in the system. We need to focus them as well on activity. What's going on? What's the mission that we have, and how do we want to deliver it to the customer? We're not very good at that right now. So many of you, I'm sure, are Facebook people on Facebook, on social media. I'll tell you a little story about how we can misuse assets, and this is another one of the cautionary tales. I'll tell you a story about my friend Dennis. And my friend Dennis, he's in his mid-40s, and he lost his wonderful wife last year to breast cancer. And it was a 2-year battle, and the whole thing was played out on social media. They talked about her treatments. They had a GoFundMe campaign. It was a very detailed and very sad thing to witness. And amazingly, at the end of 2016, Facebook, of course, wanted to remind him and show him a wonderful collection of assets and video of all these things playing out, right? And relay it all back to him. And he wrote on Facebook, "Nice try. Show me a video of my 2016 in review. It's almost like you haven't been paying attention. Right? Here's the most painful experience he's ever gone through. And of course, the Facebook algorithm just says, well, this asset got a lot of responses. It got a lot of, just if somebody clicked something. So it must be something that someone wants to see again. Completely lacking any form of empathy, completely lacking any comprehension. They didn't read the metadata. They didn't pay any attention to it. They just assumed, because it got a lot of response, that it was a good thing. There's another one of Dennis's comments. 1 year ago marked the beginning of the end. Thanks a lot for the reminder. And one of his friends said, sorry, Dennis, Facebook has no tact. No, they really don't. So when we think about digital assets, right, we've spent a lot of time, those of us who have taken the time, and the organizations that have set forth the standards and the metadata, we spend a lot of time tagging assets around what they are, but not necessarily how our customers are reacting to them. This is the next dimension of metadata. This is the next dimension of standards. How do people respond? How can we be more empathetic to how they're responding to our assets, how they feel about our assets, so we're not reminding them of things they don't want to be reminded of? I had an exchange with Dennis asking him, of course, if I could use this in my presentation, and I thought his response was very insightful. He said, it's such a mixed blessing to have these reminders, but they seem to be handled in such a tone-deaf manner. It's interesting that Facebook has all the information that Laurie was my wife. He went through the process of actually memorializing her page, sharing her death certificate with Facebook, and they're still that clueless. Let's not make the same mistake, right? Let's actually analyze what's happening on social media. How are people responding to what we put out there? We're sharing videos, we're sharing images. What's being said? And how do we collect that information to better use our assets, to better present our content, to better customize our content, to better target, to better market, etc. This is what we need. This is the next level of metadata. What's the response? How do people feel? How do we adapt what we do as an industry? If you're a technology vendor, how do you think about actually managing assets based on feeling, sentiment, emotion? So let's talk about a good example. Here's a happy one. I actually reached out on Facebook and I said, has anyone had an experience where you've had good empathy from your technology, where you're interacting with digital assets and it understood you? And Stephanie, who's here, Stephanie Lemieux, does anyone know Stephanie? Well, there she is, Stephanie, great taxonomist that she is. She said, I love you, Google Music. Everything you say is true. I do work in a Euro hotel lounge and you know that it's raining right now. So based on her phone, of course, they know what the weather is. Google knows what the weather is wherever you are, right? It also knows where her office is. And she pointed out that when she's in the office, it delivers or targets music that allows her to focus. Or if it's raining, it's actually saying, well, here's some music that's sort of about the rain or about the weather. She was even saying that when it's cold, it delivers reggae music. Right, to make her feel like maybe she's in the Caribbean having a good time. I mean, this is pretty brilliant, right? But it's also a challenge, right? It's not so easy in all situations to deliver empathetic assets. So I had a little dialogue with Stephanie on Facebook where we were talking about this, and I know it's a little tough to read, so I'll share what we were talking about. She talked about how much she liked Google Music, and then we had a dialogue about, well, how do they know? Okay, they know the weather, they know where her office is. And then I made a point that I sometimes struggle with how technology identifies patterns, okay? Because that's what's happening here. And I recently had a really good experience with the guys from ICP who were back there, working on a white paper for them, where we talked about machine learning and wrote about auto-tagging technology and sort of how good is technology really at identifying not just what's in a picture, but even what does this person want at this particular time. And one of the challenges I had recently was I installed Nest in my home. Does anyone here have Nest? Okay, there's a lot of people have Nest. And I installed Nest, and I spent days fighting with it, right? Because I didn't want it to auto-adjust at 6:15 every morning to a certain temperature, because some mornings at 6:15 I go to yoga class, and some mornings at 6:15 I have a conference call with someone in Europe, and maybe I want the heat to stay on and not go off when I walk out. I have no fixed pattern when it comes to my habits. So I had this dialogue with Stephanie where I talked about how much I really didn't like Nest and how I thought it was trying to be smarter than it really was. And she said, well, you're just too damned interesting for machine learning. And I said, well, it's really not about being interesting, it's just about being patternless. So this is tying back to the Facebook mistake. Facebook just assumes it's a black and white algorithm. It got a lot of response. So that must mean someone wants to see it again. That must mean we should regurgitate all these digital assets, even though it was pictures of the last day of this man's wife's life. Right? But then there's smarter instances where Stephanie does want to hear Caribbean music in the winter in Montreal. Okay. So as we think about how we're going to use our assets smarter, it's challenging. It's tough. Right? It's tough for an algorithm to know how I feel, how Stephanie feels, how Dennis felt. But this is our next step. Right? And that's always part of my task here, is to identify where we need to go, where we need to be thinking, and how we need to be thinking about the future, and this is how we need to be thinking about it. One of the key pieces of situational awareness with our assets has to do with responding to what we know. Right? So geographical and sort of GPS coordinates is the #1 way so far that we're able to deliver assets better, based on location. You know, if you're a retailer, if you are a consumer product goods company, knowing where someone is really helps you deliver better assets. This is Waze. I'm sure many of you use Waze. And it adapts based not only on your location, but also the information that other users are feeding in. Right? This is also what Google Music does. This is also what many of the digital asset platforms that we as consumers use every day are doing. Over time, they're learning about us, and you should be thinking the same way. How can I learn more about my customers so that I can deliver assets in a more empathetic manner and in a way that's more effective? So, tying it back to the engine, you can't buy this. You cannot buy it. You can buy a sexy engine, but it's not always going to succeed.
Contact Heathrow radar 1349 good day.
12497, good day, sir. The radar speed Concord 9180, Compton 5 Juliet, passing 3,000 feet.
Stewart 9180, good afternoon and welcome back. Running altitude 6,000, there's no ATC speed restrictions, score guider.
There are no speed restrictions. Here's the sexiest engine ever built, the sexiest plane ever built, the most awesome plane ever built. It's kind of like when people are watching a demo of a really gorgeous digital asset management system and they get so excited. This is awesome. It's going to take us across the ocean in 3 hours, and we're going to get to sit next to Sting, and it's going to be so cool. Right? And I remember the first rock concert I ever went to was Live Aid in Philadelphia in 1985. And how cool was it when Phil Collins showed up on the stage, and he had played in London a few hours ago, and we thought, wow, what's cooler than the Concorde, right? We all had the dream of flying the Concorde. But it failed miserably. Speed and design don't always win. Same is true with our dam systems. You can't just buy the sexiest tool. Why did the Concorde fail? A lot of the same reasons that our dam projects sometimes fail. Too much noise, not enough substance, right? The sonic boom meant it could only fly over the ocean, right? They couldn't actually fly. It wasn't going to make the flight from New York to LA any quicker. It was only making the flight from New York to London quicker. There was environmental concerns. There were fuel limitations. It was $12,000 a seat, kind of like the per user costs in some of our software. Or per instance, 100,000, whatever it might be, right? Sometimes it's more expensive than it needs to be. It could only carry 120 passengers, and it required a specially qualified crew. The same is true of a lot of our technology. We need to be really careful about that. Why do we fly Airbuses today rather than Concordes? They're not as luxurious, they're slower, but they're about capacity, affordability, and they're cheaper. This is where the industry has gone. Okay, it's where our dam industry has gone too. More people are buying more affordable, less expensive SaaS solutions that have higher capacity because they're in the cloud. They don't require a specialized crew because they have standard services, and they're much easier to work with. They carry more assets because you don't have to maintain that server under somebody's desk because it's an Amazon cloud or it's in Azure, whatever it might be. This is where the industry has gone for DAM technology just as much as it's gone for airplanes. It's also shifted in the sense of making money. And these are a few of my final thoughts here. We need to think about monetizing our assets. Right? We spent a lot of years getting assets into a central place, but we haven't spent a lot of years thinking about, well, how do we make more money once we've generated these assets? So this illustration, which my colleague Ed Klaris has used a lot over the years, is really to demonstrate you're going to invest a lot of money to create assets. You're going to invest a lot of money to create content. Okay? And that big investment feels like a lot of investment. But over time, the reuse is what really brings the return. Okay, so when we do ROI studies, we often think about, well, I'm investing all this money in this technology. I'm investing all this money, hopefully also in generating metadata and better content and doing marketing campaigns. But it's the reuse that really makes the money over time. It's the adaptation of assets that makes money over time. Okay, so you need to think about, how am I going to better reuse? How am I going to better adapt? How am I going to better extract? That's what gets you the return. You can't just do a simple ROI equation buying a piece of technology. Right? You need to also think in the context of the content, in the context of what you're trying to sell and what you're marketing. It's often a mix of the old and the new. One of the things I love about London is how much you can see these ancient buildings that then they adapt and change into a more modern architecture. Right, so this is one of the cities, one of the bridges walking into the city, and I just snapped this shot a couple weeks ago, where you see, here's an old building. It's okay to still be in the old building if you're still in the old building. And many of you are, I know, using DAM systems that are maybe old, or maybe you don't even have a DAM system yet. But think about, how do I take what I do and I adapt it, and grow it, make it modern, take it to the next level? How do I anticipate customer needs? And this is bringing it back to empathy. Bringing it back to trains. This is a shot that I snapped. I was on my way to a conference in Germany a few weeks ago. And what's better than the trains in the German-speaking world? Probably not much, right? They're always on time. They're always efficient. But those of you who've traveled in Europe, you know that you can look at these graphs or these signs on the tracks. And you look at your ticket. And you say, oh, I'm in car 10, seat 55. And then they give you a sign that shows, here's the train that's going between these two cities, right? So you had a train between Heidelberg and another city, and you have the train, and you know you can stand exactly under the letter C on the tracks, and your exact train car is going to stop exactly where you're standing, and you get on, and there's your seat, right? It tells you exactly where to stand. They know exactly how the train's going to pull in and where it's going to stop and where your seat's going to be on the train. Can you imagine Amtrak doing this? Can you imagine New York Transit doing this? No, I can't either. But it is a glorious thing because it's like, I'm the digital asset. I'm the digital asset, and I know exactly where to go. Right? Here's my metadata on my ticket. I know exactly what repository I can get into, and I know exactly what seat I can sit in. Boom. And I'm going to end up exactly where I'm meant to go. Isn't this great? What fabulous metadata, an illustration of how it should all work and fit together. Customer empathy.
Play voicemail.
Message 1.
Hey, this is Dave.
Stop. Delete.
Message 2.
Hello, Mr. Carlson. Your reservation request for February.
Stop. Delete.
Message 3.
Yeah, Terry, that meeting at 4 has been moved up to noon. Call me as soon as you can.
Warning. Breakdown imminent. CardTrack recommends immediate service.
Oh no, my meeting.
To locate your nearest service station, turn right at Alameda. Continue north for 1 mile. Turn left at Hersham. Proceed 2 miles to the next service station.
Hi,
Hi.
Terry Carlson.
Yes?
CardTrack alerted us you were on your way. I've got your paperwork ready to go if you'll just sign right here.
Great. Well, I guess all I need now is a cab.
Our track has arranged for a cab to pick you up, Mr. Carlson.
I guess all I need now is $1 million. Can't blame a guy for trying, right?
So this is meant to be, of course, a little facetious, but this is digital assets anticipating what our customers need before they get there. It's just like Stephanie with her Google Music. Right? It's just like me standing on the train tracks in Germany. It knows what I want, knows where I need to be, knows where I am, gets it to me optimally. So it's not just the engine. It's everything around the engine. Governance, rights, clearances, managed services, cloud, scalability, all these other things, monetization, skill sets. This is the train. These are the tracks. This is what we have to focus on building. The system is just the engine. We need to build everything around it. A few weeks ago, as a final story, I went to Brussels just for a party. It felt incredibly indulgent and just like a whimsical thing to do. And I got on the Eurostar, and I sped under the channel. And there's this magical moment, and I've ridden the Eurostar many, many times, but there's this magical moment when you come out of that tunnel and they say, "Bienvenue en France." And you think, wow, this thing just went under the English Channel. And I think about when I was a little girl and my parents first took me across the channel on one of those inflatable, like really slow boats. And how different it was and how far we've come with transport and what our engines have managed to do. And if it was just an engine, I wouldn't have been able to go to a foreign country just for a party. I wouldn't have been able to just get on this train and amazingly go under the channel so quickly, so efficiently, and carry me, my little self, as an asset to another place, to be where I was meant to be. And I think to myself, the engine and the tracks that were laid and the people that built that tunnel is stronger, and it's going to keep Europe more together than any politicians ever could. That's the power of an engine, and that's the power of everything that we build around it. So we need to think the same way, and we'll get there. Thank you.